Hello, welcome back. So, we have discussed the an approach to assessing and documenting the pathogenic parenting by the targeted rejected parent that could be accounting for the child's symptoms. Now, if the targeted rejected parent, if the parenting practices of that parent are broadly normal range, then they cannot be accounting for the child's attachment related pathology. The attachment system is very strong. It's a very resilient system. It does not spontaneously dysfunction. It does not easily dysfunction. In response to bad parenting, it more strongly motivates the child to form a bond to that parent. Insecure attachment. So if that parent, if the targeted rejected parent is broadly normal range in their parenting, then that's not accounting for the child's symptoms. They're not the pathogenic parenting. Our next procedure in the differential diagnosis is to shift over and assess and document the symptoms for pathogenic parenting by an allied narcissistic borderline parent in a cross-generational coalition with the child. So that becomes our next differential diagnostic area of concern. The difficulty becomes assessing the pathogenic parenting and documenting the pathogenic parenting by the allied narcissistic borderline parent is very difficult to do because that parent is hiding behind the child. It's not me, it's the child who has it. And so they're hiding their control behind the child. And in addition, that psychological control is very subtle. It's very manipulative. And so it's hard to identify. It's hard to document that they're doing it. It has to do with partly with the attunement and misattunement to the child. So, and that goes into Stern and talking about Stern and intersubjectivity. So when the parent attunes to the child's experience, that amplifies the child's experience. When the parent misattunes, that dampens the child's experience. So when the child is critical of the parent, the narcissist, of the targeted parent, the narcissistic borderline parent attunes to the child and amplifies that experience of hostility and criticism in the child for the other parent. When that child bonds to the other parent or shows any sort of signs of affectionate bonding, the narcissistic parent misattunes to the child and dampens the child's experience of affection and bonding to the other parent. So it's very subtle about attunement and misattunement and intersubjective field. And so it's hard to document that. If we wanted to document it, we'd have to get videos of the parent-child interactions and code the videos for how that process takes place. It ain't going to happen. I mean, that's just, no. So it's nearly impossible to document. And that's been one of the problems everybody's been struggling with. How do you document the pathogenic parenting by an allied parent? Here's my recommendation. Here's what I would suggest. And what I suggest is that instead of trying to document directly the pathogenic parenting, what we're going to do is we're going to lift the fingerprints of the psychological control by a narcissistic borderline parent from off of the child's symptom display. So we're going to look at the child's symptom display because we're diagnosing or we're identifying pathogenic parenting. So it's parenting practices that are producing pathology in the child. So we're going to look at the child's pathology and lift the fingerprints of psychological control by the narcissistic parent. And so that's how we document the pathogenic parenting, is by lifting the fingerprints of psychological control by the pathogenic parenting from off of the child's symptoms. So that's why foundations had to define the pathology. We all needed to define the pathology within standard and established constructs and principles so we could identify what symptom features this particular pathology shows up with. What are the fingerprints of psychological control by a narcissistic borderline parent? There's three of them. I've identified three. That if you find these three symptom features in the child's symptom display, there is no other pathology in all of mental health, nothing else will produce that specific set of three symptoms other than narcissistic borderline parent who isn't formed a cross-generational coalition with the child against the other parent. That's the only way that you will see these three symptom features in the child symptom display. So let's run through what those three symptom features are. Number one, an attachment-related pathology where a child's rejecting a parent surrounding a normal range and affectionately available parent. So child's rejection of a normal range and affectionately available parent. That puts the whole pathology within the domain of the attachment system. So now, because we have the attachment pathology, we have the pathogenic parenting by one parent or the other. And it's towards a normal range and affectionately available parent. So we've already ruled out the pathogenic parenting by the targeted rejected parent. Because we've decided, no, we've assessed that, we've come to the conclusion, based on our assessment, that's a normal range parent. So the diagnostic indicator one is an attachment system suppression from the child towards a normal range and affectionately available parent. Number one. Number two are the narcissistic symptoms that are the psychological fingerprints of control by a narcissistic borderline parent. That's what we discussed in the conflict symptoms. So we're looking at a narcissistic personality pathology in a child. Those are the fingerprints, the psychological fingerprints in the child's symptoms of psychological control by a narcissistic borderline parent. That child's not narcissistic. It's the parent who's narcissistic, who has the absence of empathy towards the other spouse, who has a haughty and arrogant attitude towards the other spouse, who has the negativity and the demonization of the other spouse. It's the spouse who has those feelings, and they're controlling the child, and the child is acquiring that. So that's diagnostic indicator 2. Now, with diagnostic indicator 2, there's also the anxiety symptoms. So those two features, the narcissistic hostile conflict one and the anxiety one, they can show up together. They can show up one, not the other. Okay, so and so oftentimes with the anxiety symptoms, when they show up by themselves, that's oftentimes a young child, 4, 5, 6 years old, and the young children don't have quite the self-structure yet to be able to acquire the narcissistic symptoms, but they're getting a strong message, that baby monkey communication about fear of snakes, that the other parent represents a danger to the child. So they're getting a lot of parental anxiety signals, and they are acquiring this phobic anxiety response. Typically, we will see it at the visitation transfer and just prior to the visitation transfer. You'll see this massive anxiety phobic response in these young kids. And so that when you see anxiety alone, that's typically the presentation of it. Oftentimes it shows up with the narcissistic symptoms, where the child has the narcissistic traits, but then also expresses anxiety and stress around being with the targeted rejected parent. And then you'll just see the hostile conflict narcissistic symptoms by themselves. So that's diagnostic indicator 2. The presence of the 5 narcissistic personality traits or a phobic anxiety mother type or father type in the child symptom display. The third symptom on the diagnostic checklist is one of the most interesting symptoms, and it is diagnostic, and that is the child's fixed and false belief that's maintained despite contrary evidence. So it's a delusion. Fixed and false belief in the child's supposed victimization by a normal range and affectionately available targeted parent. Now, the belief in victimization, that's called persecutory, and the fact that it only affects the targeted rejected parents, not a broad-scale delusion, would make it an encapsulated delusion. So it's an encapsulated persecutory delusion being expressed by the child regarding their victimization by the normal range parenting of the targeted rejected parent. And this symptom, this delusional persecutory belief in the child's victimization, is emerging from a very characteristic feature of this pathology, and that's the trauma reenactment narrative. This is an attachment-related pathology. And so we're in the world of the attachment system. And the attachment system develops develops patterns of forming relationships. And those are called internal working models or schemas for attachment bonding. And in trauma, when the attachment system is traumatized in childhood, there's a schema pattern that develops for abusive parent, victimized child, protective parent. Abusive parent, victimized child, protective parent. That's a schema pattern of child trauma, child attachment trauma. Now, the narcissistic borderline parent has this schema pattern, has these internal working models in their attachment networks. That's part of their attachment system, are this set of schema models. And what they're doing is they're bringing this set of schema models into the current family relationships. And they are reenacting the patterns from their own childhood into the current family relationships. The abusive parent, victimized child, protective parent. And the way they are creating this trauma reenactment narrative is by getting the child, manipulating the child, convincing the child to adopt the victimized child role within that trauma reenactment narrative. And so all they have to do is get the child to believe that the child is being victimized by the parenting practices of the targeted rejected parent, because the moment the child adopts the victimized child role, that automatically defines the other two roles in the narrative. Automatically, the moment we have a victimized child, we automatically have an abusive parent. That's just part of the narrative. I don't care what the targeted parent actually does. The moment we have a victimized child, that defines we must have an abusive parent, okay? Because we have a victimized child. And so automatically defines the role, and then we just slot in the targeted parent into that role. In addition, once the child adopts a victimized child stance, that allows the targeted parent to then assume the protective parent role. I'm protecting the child from the abusive targeted rejected parent. And so the allied narcissistic borderline parent self-adopts, and conspicuously displays this role as the protective parent for this poor victimized child who's being abused by the targeted parent. But it's all a false drama. It's not true. It's that pattern from the childhood of the narcissistic borderline parent that's being enacted into the current. The targeted parent is not abusive. They're normal range. That's what we documented over on the parenting practices rating scale. This is a normal range parent. So they're not an abusive parent. The child is not being victimized. We look at the parenting practice, we look at that, and this is normal. This is normal range parenting. You're not being victimized. The allied parent is not being a protective parent. That's a narcissistic parent who's creating all sorts of pathology in the child. That's not a protective parent. So all of this is a kabuki theater. All of it's a false drama being recreated out of the schema patterns, the internal working models of the narcissistic borderline parent. So this victimization role that the child adopts is false. It's not true. And that's the delusion. That's the source of the delusion here. The child has this fixed and false belief that they are being victimized by the normal range parenting of the targeted parent, because that's the delusion of the parent, the narcissistic borderline parent. That's their belief system that the child is acquiring relative to the other parent. It's the psychological fingerprints, this third diagnostic indicator, the psychological fingerprints of that attachment trauma in the parent that is coming through to the child. There is no other way a child acquires or develops an encapsulated persecutory delusion of victimization by the normal range parenting of a targeted parent. The attachment system is motivating bonding to that parent. There is nothing that produces an encapsulated persecutory delusion of victimization by a normal range parent, except the shared psychotic, the shared delusional belief. It's the parent who holds the delusion. It's the parent who has that victimized child, abusive parent, protective parent pattern. It's the parent who has that fixed and false belief that is then transferring it to the child through aberrant and distorted parenting practices. There is no other way in professional, in psychological literature and descriptions that a child will develop 5 specific narcissistic personality traits directed specifically towards a parent. Narcissistic personality traits. Other than control, psychological control by a narcissistic parent in a cross-generational coalition. Children do not spontaneously develop narcissistic personality disorders. Poof, I've got a narcissistic. No, it doesn't happen that way. The child's narcissistic symptoms are not authentic to the child. They're being caused by the cross-generational coalition with the parent. It's the parent who has those symptoms. Anxiety symptoms, phobic anxiety, same thing. It's not an authentic phobic anxiety towards targeted parent. Targeted parent's fine. They're not a threat. They're not a danger. There's nothing there. There's no there for a phobic anxiety. It's being caused by the parent. We don't ever see an attachment rejection, a rejection of a parent in normal kids. We never see that. That's severe pathogenic parenting to create that kind of pathology in a child. We don't see a child's rejection of a normal range and affectionately available parent. That's not the way the attachment is. We don't see that in normal kids. We don't see the narcissistic symptoms in normal kids. We don't see the encapsulated delusion in normal kids. Each one of those symptoms is indicative of pathogenic parenting by an allied narcissistic borderline parent who's formed a cross-generational coalition. Each one of those individually. But the diagnosis of this type of pathology, pathogenic parenting by the allied narcissistic borderline parent, is made by the presence of all 3 of these. All 3 of these have to be present in order to say, yep, that's pathogenic parenting by an allied narcissistic borderline parent. Because that's the only thing that can account for these 3 symptoms in the child symptom display. That's how we assess and document the pathogenic parenting by the allied narcissistic borderline parent. What we're doing with those 3 is we are lifting the psychological influence, the fingerprints of psychological influence, because what we are identifying is pathogenic parenting. It's a parenting practices that are producing pathology in the child, so we are looking at the child symptoms to lift the fingerprints of that pathogenic parenting from off the child's symptom display. That's the assessment of pathogenic parenting. It's a differential diagnostic assessment. You look at one, you look at the other, and you document the data, the information from those assessments. And so that's my recommended approach to addressing the differential diagnosis of pathogenic parenting by one parent or the other. Because we know if we have an attachment-related pathology, it's being produced by one parent or the other.